There's something deeply unsettling about old photographs, the way faces stare back at you, frozen in time, their smiles hiding secrets that only the dead remember. But what if one of those faces didn't belong to the living at all? Imagine flipping through generations of family wedding photos from 1854 to 1920 and finding the same man standing in the background of each, unchanged, unsmiling, and unmistakably lifeless. Tonight, we travel to the heart of 19th century Arkansas to uncover a story that blurs the line between the living and the damned. A story whispered in the rural towns and buried in the Thornfield family's dark legacy. In 1854, the Thornfield family of Pine Hollow, Arkansas, stood as one of the wealthiest and most admired families in the southern countryside. Their sprawling plantations stretched across acres of fertile land, lined with oak trees and white magnolias that whispered in the humid wind. The Thornfields were known for their influence, their hospitality, and their charm that drew the attention of every neighboring town. Yet, behind the polished surface of their reputation lingered a sense of something unspoken, a quiet unease that clung to the corridors of their grand estate like damp air after a storm. The family portraits that hung in the long hallways showed generations of Thornfields with proud expressions. But if one looked closely enough, a faint shadow always seemed to rest behind them, as though the house itself remembered something it wished to forget. The first real sign of that hidden darkness would appear years later, when the family's collection of wedding photographs began to reveal something no living soul could explain. These photographs, taken over decades, each captured joyous moments of marriage and celebration, bright young brides, nervous grooms, guests smiling in their finest clothes. Yet in every photograph, without fail, there appeared a single figure who did not belong. Standing slightly apart from the others, pale and rigid, was the same man, always wearing the same dark, outdated suit, his eyes hollow and distant, his presence unchanging through time. It did not matter whether the year was 1854 or 1899, whether the photograph was black and white or sepia-toned, the same man remained, haunting the backdrop like a ghost refusing to fade. At first, the Thornfields thought it was a mistake, a trick of the camera, or perhaps an uncanny resemblance between distant relatives, but the more they examined the photos, the more undeniable it became that this was no mere coincidence. The figure's posture never shifted, his expression never softened, and his clothing, especially the old-fashioned cravat and long morning coat, never matched the style of the period in which the photograph was taken. Guests who had attended the weddings swore they had never seen such a man among them. The discovery sent a tremor of fear through the family, yet it also drew them deeper into their own history, into the story of the one Thornfield who should have been there only in memory. That man was Elias Thornfield, the eldest son of the family, whose tragic death had cast a shadow over the estate nearly a century before the final photographs were taken. Elias had been known as a kind and gentle soul, beloved by his siblings and adored by the townspeople of Pine Hollow. On the eve of his wedding in 1854, he had gone down to the river near the family estate to reflect, as the story went. The next morning, he was found missing, and all that was discovered was his hat floating in the murky water near the cypress roots. His fiancée, a young woman from a neighboring plantation, was said to have collapsed from grief, and within weeks she too vanished, leaving behind only her veil. The Thornfields held a memorial service, but without a body there was no burial, only a symbolic grave beneath the oldest oak on the property. For years afterward, whispers spread through the town that Elias had not simply drowned. Some claimed he had been pulled under by something unseen, while others believed his spirit could not rest because of the sorrow he carried. When the first Thornfield wedding photo surfaced decades later, with a pale man in mourning clothes standing just behind the bride, older residents immediately recognized the resemblance. The structure of the face, the distant expression, even the tilt of the head. It was all too close to Elias to ignore. The Thornfields themselves grew divided over what to believe. Some wanted to destroy the photographs, convinced that to keep them was to invite whatever haunted their family closer. Others saw them as proof of an enduring bond, a sign that Elias was watching over them, still part of the family even in death. Yet, as each new wedding passed and the same figure reappeared again and again, it became harder to view his presence as benevolent. The eyes that stared from the background seemed less like those of a guardian and more like those of a watcher, fixed and cold, detached from the world of the living. Guests began to refuse to attend Thornfield weddings, fearing the curse that seemed to follow. Rumors spread through Pine Hollow that the family had tampered with forces best left alone, that their wealth and standing had been bought at the cost of peace with the dead. Old servants whispered that they had seen candlelight flickering in Elias's abandoned room at night, and one maid claimed she heard footsteps pacing near the river long after midnight. Even the family matriarch, a stern woman who dismissed all talk of superstition, was once found staring at one of the photographs for hours, her lips moving silently, as if speaking to the ghostly image staring back. As the decades passed, the story of the Thornfields became inseparable from the mystery of the photographs. Historians, spiritualists, and curious strangers came to study them, each leaving more disturbed than before. Some said the air around the photographs felt colder, as if the presence within them drew warmth from the room. Others claimed to see faint outlines of mist forming behind the figure when the photos were exposed to light. But what disturbed everyone most was that the man never appeared to age. In a span of over 70 years, through changing technology and multiple generations, the same expression, the same lifeless posture remained constant, untouched by time or decay. Even those who had never believed in ghosts found themselves unsettled by the evidence. The Thornfield family, once proud and admired, slowly withdrew from public life, their grand estate growing quiet and overgrown. The photographs were stored away, locked in a chest, as if by hiding them, the family could shut away the truth of what haunted them. But no matter how tightly the lid was sealed, the story continued to spread, whispered across Arkansas in hushed tones. The tale of the Thornfields and the dead man who refused to leave their weddings. Locals in Pine Hollow had always spoken of the Thornfield family with a mixture of admiration and unease, but when the strange figure began appearing in the family's photographs, whispers turned into fearful speculation. It did not take long for the townspeople to put a name to the ghostly man who never seemed to age. They said it was Elias Thornfield, the eldest son of the family, whose tragic drowning had marked the beginning of the Thornfields' long descent into sorrow. Elias had been the pride of his father, a man of refinement and intellect who often quoted poetry and spent hours sketching the riverbanks that bordered their land. He was gentle, the kind of man the servants described as having a light in his eyes, a softness that set him apart from the stern Thornfield men before him. His death had struck the family like a hammer blow, and though they tried to continue their lives as before, something in the atmosphere of the estate had changed forever. The story of Elias's death was simple enough on the surface, but the details never sat quite right with those who knew him. On a warm June evening in 1854, just days before his wedding, Elias was last seen walking toward the river, carrying a lantern. He told the housekeeper he wished to be alone, to think before the ceremony. When he did not return by morning, a search was organized, and after hours of combing the riverbank, they found only his hat caught among the reeds. No body, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just silence and the slow, steady current of the Arkansas River. His fiancée, Clara Hensley, was inconsolable. She refused to eat or speak for days and was found wandering near the river at night, calling his name. Within a week, she too disappeared, leaving behind only her white bridal veil caught on a branch near the water's edge. From that day forward, the Thornfield estate seemed to fall under a strange shadow. The family chapel, where Elias and Clara were meant to be married, was closed and never used again. The riverbank where he had vanished grew wild, overrun with vines and strange, pale flowers that locals swore had never grown there before. Some of the field hands claimed to see a man standing by the water on foggy nights, holding a lantern that flickered in and out like a heartbeat. Others heard soft humming carried on the breeze, a tune no one recognized but which made dogs howl and horses bolt in terror. By the time photography became common in the region, most believed the story of Elias Thornfield was just an old southern ghost tale, the kind of thing told to frighten children into staying home after dark. But when the first Thornfield wedding photograph surfaced, showing what looked like Elias standing behind the bride, that old legend found new life. The photograph was clear, too detailed to be dismissed as a blur or shadow. There he stood, in the same mourning clothes described by those who claimed to have seen his ghost, his face unmistakably unchanged from portraits painted before his death. At first, the family dismissed it as an eerie coincidence, perhaps a trick of exposure or a guest whose features resembled Elias's. But when the same figure appeared in another wedding photo a decade later, and again in the next generations, all doubt began to crumble. People in Pine Hollow whispered that Elias was bound to the family by unfinished business, that his spirit could not rest because of the way he had died. Some said he had been murdered, his death covered up by the Thornfields to protect their name, while others believed he had taken his own life after learning a terrible secret about his bride. The most chilling theory was that Elias had not drowned at all, that something in the river had claimed him, and that what appeared in the photographs was not Elias Thornfield as he once was, but the thing that came back wearing his face. The curse of the dead guest began to take on a life of its own. Each generation of Thornfields grew more fearful of the weddings that should have been joyous occasions. Brides would beg not to have their photographs taken, terrified of what might appear in the background. Yet tradition held strong, and the family's insistence on recording every marriage only fed the legend further. Servants spoke of the photographs whispering at night when left unattended, of faint fingerprints appearing on the glass, as if someone trapped within was trying to get out. The Thornfield men grew distant, their eyes hollow with the same dread that haunted their ancestors. By the late 1800s, the story had spread far beyond Pine Hollow. Travelers came from neighboring towns just to see the old estate where the ghost of Elias Thornfield supposedly lingered. The townsfolk avoided the place, warning that those who stayed too long near the river felt a cold presence watching them from beneath the water. Fishermen swore they saw ripples when there was no wind, and on certain nights the faint glow of a lantern would drift across the current before vanishing suddenly, as if pulled below. In family letters that survived, one of the Thornfield women wrote about the growing fear inside the house. She described waking in the middle of the night to see muddy footprints on the stairs leading up from the back door that faced the river. She wrote about hearing the soft click of a camera shutter in the empty ballroom, even though the photographer had left hours earlier. The Thornfields had begun to believe that Elias did not simply appear in the photographs but was drawn to them, as if the act of capturing a moment of love and union summoned him from the shadows. Old church records from Pine Hollow mention an exorcism attempted by the local priest, who believed the spirit of Elias could be freed if the original wedding ceremony were completed symbolically. The family arranged it in secret, using a distant cousin to stand in as the bride, and held the ritual at midnight in the same chapel that had been closed for decades. Witnesses said that during the vows, the candles flickered and the temperature dropped so sharply that everyone could see their breath. Moments later, one of the candles exploded, showering the altar in wax, and the ceremony was abandoned in chaos. From that night onward, no one dared speak of the Thornfield ghost aloud within the house. But even silence could not banish him. The photographs continued to appear with that same spectral figure, sometimes faint, sometimes clear as day, always near the bride, always with the same vacant stare. Those who studied the images noticed strange details that changed over time. In some, his hands appeared slightly closer to the couple than before. In others, his reflection could be seen in the mirrors, though no one else's was captured that way. It was as if, with every wedding, every generation, Elias was drawing nearer to something he had lost long ago, pulled by forces neither time nor death could loosen. What began as whispers of a family ghost soon twisted into something darker, when people noticed an unsettling pattern linking the Thornfield brides to the mysterious presence captured in their wedding photographs. Each time the spectral figure appeared, tragedy followed. It started subtly, dismissed as cruel coincidence, but over the years the pattern became too distinct to ignore. Every Thornfield bride who had stood before the camera and smiled while that pale man lingered in the background would, within a year of her vows, meet a fate that was either violent, mysterious, or heartbreakingly unnatural. It was as though marriage itself had become a death sentence for the women who dared to join the Thornfield line, as if something unseen had claimed ownership over them from the moment the photograph was taken. The first bride to meet such a fate was Margaret Thornfield, the wife of Elias's younger brother, Henry. Their marriage had been a modest one compared to the grand celebrations of the past, for the Thornfield fortune had already begun to dwindle. Still, the day was filled with music, candlelight, and laughter. The wedding photograph taken afterward showed all the guests gathered in front of the mansion's veranda, their faces glowing with joy. But in the far back, half-shadowed by the vines that climbed the pillars, stood the familiar figure. Tall, still, eyes sunken yet piercing even through the age of the print. Margaret's death came just 8 months later. She was found floating in the same river where Elias had disappeared, her body caught among the reeds in nearly the same spot where his hat had been found years before. There was no sign of struggle, no explanation. Her husband swore she had been fine the night before, humming softly as she brushed her hair. No one could explain how she ended up there, barefoot and dressed in her nightgown, her expression strangely peaceful. After that, unease became a constant companion in the Thornfield household. Servants crossed themselves when photographs were mentioned, and family members began refusing to attend weddings altogether. Still, the Thornfields were a family bound by pride and tradition. They continued to marry, continued to pose for the camera, and with each generation, the curse deepened. The next bride, Josephine Thornfield, married in 1871. She was young, beautiful, and known for her kindness. The photograph from her wedding shows her smiling shyly beside her husband, unaware of the pale silhouette standing in the far left corner, partially obscured by the heavy drapes. 10 months later, Josephine fell ill with a fever that no doctor could name. Her body withered rapidly, her skin turning ashen, her eyes clouded with terror before death finally claimed her. On her deathbed, she whispered something that made her husband's blood run cold. She said that she had seen Elias watching her from the mirror every night since the wedding, standing behind her reflection, silent and patient. As the years went on, the curse began to feel almost ritualistic. It seemed that no matter what precautions were taken, the pattern repeated itself: the wedding, the photograph, the same ghostly figure, and the inevitable death. By the time the third generation of Thornfields came of age, the family was consumed by paranoia. Some refused to marry altogether, while others left Pine Hollow entirely, hoping that distance would free them from the shadow of their ancestors. But even those who left weren't entirely spared. Letters from distant relatives in Louisiana and Tennessee told of strange happenings, of brides waking to muddy footprints by their beds, of water stains appearing on their ceilings even in dry weather, of hearing a man's voice calling their name in the dark. There was one story, passed down in whispers, of a Thornfield bride named Eleanor who tried to outwit the curse. She and her husband married in secret, refusing to hire a photographer, believing that the absence of a photograph would prevent the spirit from finding them. For a time, it seemed to work. They moved away from Arkansas and settled near St. Louis, far from the river and the family's haunted estate. But less than a year later, Eleanor disappeared during a thunderstorm. Her husband searched for days before discovering her wedding dress laid out neatly on the riverbank miles from their home, her veil pinned in place as if waiting for someone to return. Her body was never found, and when the Thornfields later gathered what few belongings had been recovered, they discovered something that made even the most skeptical among them shiver: a water-damaged photograph of a wedding couple that had never been taken, and in its background, faint but visible, stood the same unaging man. From then on, people stopped calling it coincidence. They began to say Elias Thornfield's spirit was jealous, unable to rest because of the love he had lost and the wedding he was denied. Some believed that each bride's soul was being taken as a replacement for the woman he was meant to marry, that every photograph captured not just a moment in time, but an invitation to his lingering grief. Others whispered of darker things, that Elias's ghost had become something far more vengeful, that his love had rotted into obsession, binding every Thornfield bride to a cycle of death and sorrow that would not end until the family line itself was extinguished. As the decades passed, the Thornfield name became synonymous with tragedy. Their once grand mansion grew silent, its windows shuttered, its gardens overtaken by wild vines. Travelers who passed through Pine Hollow told stories of seeing figures in the windows, of hearing faint laughter carried on the wind followed by sudden weeping. Locals claimed that on certain nights, if you stood by the river, you could see the reflection of a man holding a lantern, staring toward the house as though waiting for someone to come home. Every few years, a new Thornfield marriage would spark renewed dread, and inevitably, another photograph would surface, each one a little clearer, the ghostly figure a little closer to the bride. What unsettled people most was the expression on the faces of the brides in those final photographs. They were smiling, radiant, but their eyes seemed to hold something else, an almost imperceptible fear, as if some small part of them could already sense the fate waiting just beyond the frame. To those who studied the images, it felt as if the camera had captured not just the living, but the slow encroachment of something from another world, a presence that reached out through generations, feeding on love and loss in equal measure. Even when photography advanced, even when the Thornfields tried to avoid tradition or change locations, the figure always found its way back into the frame. It was as if he was drawn not to the place or the event, but to the emotion itself, the vow, the promise, the fragile human hope that death could not conquer love. By the turn of the century, the Thornfield estate had become a relic of a bygone era, its former grandeur fading beneath layers of dust, rot, and rumor. The once bustling halls that had echoed with laughter and music now stood silent except for the creak of settling wood and the occasional sigh of wind slipping through cracked windows. The chandeliers hung dark, their crystal pendants dulled by cobwebs, and the great staircase, once the pride of the house, had begun to sag under the weight of neglect. The Thornfields who remained lived as if trapped between worlds, haunted by their own bloodline, unable to escape the curse that had bound them for generations. Even those who claimed not to believe in ghosts avoided the old portrait gallery, where eyes painted long ago seemed to follow anyone who dared pass through. And at the heart of every lingering fear was that same figure, the pale man whose image refused to die with time, the one who appeared again and again in the family's wedding photographs like an eternal witness. By 1901, the Thornfields had stopped hosting public events, but the townspeople of Pine Hollow still whispered about strange sights on the estate grounds. Lights flickered in the windows late at night, as though some unseen celebration were taking place. Some swore they heard music playing, the slow waltz that had once been Elias Thornfield's favorite song. Travelers passing on the road after dark spoke of seeing a man in outdated black clothing standing by the gate, staring silently toward the house. He never moved or spoke, and when anyone approached, he vanished into the mist. The few remaining servants who dared to stay told of doors opening on their own, of mirrors fogging without cause, of faint wet footprints appearing on the marble floors, leading from nowhere and ending at the grand staircase. They said the air always felt heavier in the ballroom, as if the space itself remembered every wedding, every vow, every sorrowful ending that had followed. When the last Thornfield wedding was planned in 1918, there was no sense of joy in the preparations. It was held more out of duty than love, an attempt to keep the family name alive despite its cursed reputation. The bride, a distant cousin named Charlotte, had grown up hearing the stories whispered like nursery rhymes, the drowned brother, the ghostly figure in the photographs, the brides who never lived to see another anniversary. She laughed it off in public, but those closest to her said she had nightmares leading up to the ceremony. She would wake drenched in sweat, claiming to hear a man calling her name in the dark, his voice echoing like it came from underwater. Still, she went through with the wedding, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps because she felt that to resist the curse was to give it power. The photographer who had been hired for the event, a man named Harold Finch from Little Rock, was warned in advance about the family's strange history. He was not a superstitious man, and he agreed to the job with a shrug, though he would later tell friends that he felt uneasy the moment he stepped through the front door. The air inside the mansion was unnaturally cold despite the midsummer heat, and his camera, which had worked perfectly during testing, began to malfunction for no apparent reason. Plates cracked, exposures blurred, and on one attempt, the image burned out entirely, leaving behind only a faint outline that looked disturbingly like a hand pressed against the lens. During the ceremony itself, several guests reported hearing a faint sobbing sound, though no one could find the source. Others said they felt a sudden gust of wind sweep through the chapel as the couple exchanged vows, strong enough to snuff out the candles and plunge the room into darkness. When the lights were restored, Charlotte's expression had changed, her smile gone, her eyes distant, as though she had heard something only she could understand. Finch developed the photographs days later, and what he saw made his hands shake so violently that he dropped the first print. There, standing just behind the bride, partly obscured by her veil, was a figure unmistakably similar to the others from decades past. The same hollow eyes, the same dark coat, the same expression caught between sorrow and rage. Finch swore he had seen no such man during the wedding, and yet the figure's clarity was too perfect to be a mistake of light or exposure. The image quickly spread among the locals, reigniting old fears. Within months, tragedy struck once again. Charlotte Thornfield vanished without a trace, her bedroom found in disarray, the curtains torn as though by desperate hands. Her husband claimed she had gone sleepwalking, but search parties found nothing, only her wedding shoes left neatly on the edge of the riverbank, their white satin stained with mud. After that night, no one in the family spoke of holding another wedding. The Thornfield line, once so proud and prosperous, effectively ended with Charlotte's disappearance. The estate was left to crumble, its great rooms abandoned and its gardens overtaken by weeds. Locals avoided it altogether, swearing that those who lingered near the property after sundown heard faint music drifting from the ballroom and saw candlelight moving from room to room, as if some endless celebration was still taking place inside. They said that if you looked too long at the windows, you might catch sight of a woman in white standing beside a man in black, the two swaying together in an eternal dance, forever bound by tragedy. In the years that followed, the Thornfield estate became a place of fascination for the curious and the foolish. Photographers, journalists, and even early spiritualists visited, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. A few succeeded, though their findings brought them no comfort. One photograph taken in 1923 showed the ballroom in disarray, the furniture overturned, yet in the reflection of a shattered mirror stood the unmistakable silhouette of the same man, unchanged since 1854. Another visitor, a professor from Missouri, attempted to take one of the wedding photos for study, only to return it days later, pale and trembling, claiming he had woken every night to the sound of dripping water and the faint weight of a hand resting on his chest. As the decades slipped by, the Thornfield photographs found their way into a small archive in Little Rock, where they remain under careful preservation. Staff members have reported inexplicable cold spots near the cabinet where the photos are kept, and the faint smell of damp earth that lingers whenever the case is opened. Some say that if you stare long enough at the oldest photo, the one from Elias's time, you can see the faintest ripple in the glass, as if something beneath its surface is still moving, still waiting, still watching. Today, the Thornfield photographs are kept locked away in a temperature-controlled archive in Little Rock, catalogued and preserved by a small team of historians who handle them with gloved hands and uneasy glances. Officially, they are classified as family artifacts of the late 19th century, important for their contribution to the early documentation of southern plantation life. Unofficially, they are whispered about among curators and archivists as cursed relics, objects that carry with them a chill that no amount of technology or reasoning can explain. Visitors to the archive often describe a peculiar sensation when standing near the cabinet where the photographs are stored. A sudden drop in temperature, the faint smell of wet earth, and the subtle feeling of being watched. Some dismiss it as suggestion, a product of the story that surrounds them. But those who have spent long hours in that room speak differently, saying that the atmosphere changes as soon as the drawer slides open, as though something unseen stirs at the faint scrape of metal and glass. The photographs themselves are striking, not only for their clarity and preservation, but for the haunting consistency of the figure who appears within them. Across decades in different lighting, among different generations of Thornfields, he remains the same. His posture, his clothing, even the distant gaze in his eyes are unaltered by time or decay. Archivists who have studied the collection under magnification have found details that defy normal explanation. In some photos, the faint shimmer of moisture seems to cling to the man's coat, as though he had just stepped from the rain. In others, his outline appears slightly blurred, as if in motion, while every other subject in the frame stands perfectly still. The strangest detail, however, lies in the lighting itself. No matter where the candles or sunlight fell in the room, no matter the direction from which the photograph was taken, the pale man's face is always lit from beneath, casting faint shadows upward, a phenomenon impossible under normal conditions. Over the years, researchers have brought in a variety of specialists, photographic historians, image analysts, even paranormal investigators, to study the Thornfield collection. The findings, though meticulously documented, raise more questions than they answer. Some experts insist that the consistency of the figure could be the result of early double exposure techniques, but this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. The earliest Thornfield photographs predate the use of such methods in rural Arkansas, and the equipment available at that time could not have produced such precise results across so many decades and photographers. Others have speculated that the figure was an actor or a family acquaintance intentionally inserted as a morbid tradition, Yet the records contain no mention of such a practice, and family diaries from each generation express shock and fear upon discovering the figure's presence. What unsettles the modern viewer most is not the question of how he appeared, but why his image persists with such eerie consistency, as though he exists outside the rules of light and time altogether. Paranormal investigators who have been granted permission to view the collection under controlled conditions report a range of disturbing experiences. Some claim that when the lights dim, faint ripples can be seen moving through the glass frames, like reflections disturbed by invisible water. Others have described hearing soft rhythmic sounds, the muffled click of a camera shutter, the distant rustle of clothing, or the low hum of a tune that cannot be traced to any source. A few have gone so far as to say they saw the man's expression shift ever so slightly when viewed through certain lenses, his head tilting as if aware of their gaze. One investigator, after spending several nights alone in the archive, left abruptly and never returned, leaving behind a single note that read only, "He is not in the photo. The photo is in him." For the local people of Arkansas, the Thornfield legend has never really faded. Generations have grown up hearing the story told by candlelight, the tale of the man who drowned before his wedding and now stands forever beside the living, a ghost who cannot let go. The old Thornfield estate, though long abandoned, still draws the curious. Some who venture too close claim to see faint lights glowing in the ballroom windows, or to hear the echo of laughter and music carried faintly on the wind. Others report seeing a figure standing on the balcony, still and watching, before vanishing into the darkness. Urban explorers who have snuck inside the house describe walls marked by damp stains that resemble the shape of human hands and mirrors that fog over when approached, revealing faint outlines before clearing again. Even those who dismiss the supernatural admit there is something uncanny about the Thornfield story. Historians who have examined the archives note that while the family records are meticulously kept, births, deaths, marriages, there is no mention anywhere of Elias Thornfield after 1854. Not even a memorial entry, as though the family collectively decided to erase him. Yet his face remains, defying time, etched into every photograph that marks the family's milestones. It is as if he continued his presence not through memory, but through the physical act of documentation itself. Scholars of folklore have written that this may explain why the curse endures, that Elias, denied rest in life and erasure in death, bound himself to every captured moment of Thornfield love, feeding off the ritual that had once destroyed him. In recent years, the legend has drawn renewed attention from filmmakers and online storytellers, eager to explore the eerie intersection of history and horror. Yet, those who have used the original photographs in documentaries or digital scans often report strange technical malfunctions. Audio distortions appear without cause, files corrupt inexplicably, and in one notorious case, a photo editing program froze completely when the spectral figure's face was magnified. The technician who experienced it described seeing a reflection in his monitor that did not match his own, someone standing just behind his shoulder, wearing a dark coat. The archive itself has become something of a local pilgrimage site for those fascinated by the paranormal. On certain anniversaries, the day of Elias Thornfield's disappearance or the date of the last Thornfield wedding, people gather outside the building, lighting candles and whispering prayers or dares. Security guards have grown used to the disturbances that follow on those nights. Sudden drops in temperature, the faint fogging of security camera lenses, and an intermittent tapping sound that comes from inside the cabinet holding the photographs. No rational explanation has ever been found. For the few remaining descendants of the Thornfield family, the curse remains a quiet, inherited burden. Some have changed their names, moved across states, and refused to marry altogether, believing that the ghost of Elias still watches and waits, bound not to the land but to the act of union itself. In their homes, photographs are rare, and wedding portraits are never taken. Still, the legend persists, whispered through generations as both warning and memory. The Thornfield photographs, sealed behind glass and light-proof cases, are not merely relics of the past, but living echoes of a story that refuses to end. A story that blurs the boundary between the living and the dead. A story that waits patiently as the same dead guest stands eternal in every frame.